This is episode 138 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Ros Barber, author of the Marlowe Papers. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Davenant was a man who always was able to charm everyone. He must have been a fantastically likable man because everybody loved him.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
During the century following Shakespeare's life, the government tried to end playgoing altogether, shutting down theaters and passing orders against plays entirely. During this moment in history when it would have been very easy for the legacy of William Shakespeare to die out completely, one man who remembered William Shakespeare from his childhood would champion the cause of theater, plays, and his mentor, William Shakespeare, to carry the legacy forward, to survive the era of Oliver Cromwell, and potentially serve as the reason we continue to enjoy Shakespeare's plays today. That man was William Davenant. Through the course of his life, Davenant, through his charm and ability to tell great stories, worked his way up the status ladder in London to become not only a poet laureate, but also a respected theater owner and playwright who worked alongside greats like Jonson, Milton and John Donne. As a holder of the only theater patent in London, Davenant would use his stage to showcase 10 of Shakespeare's most celebrated works. And while decidedly a devotee of Shakespeare, William Davenant is recorded as claiming to be the son of William Shakespeare, and many historians believe he was actually Shakespeare's godson. Here to share with us more about the life of William Davenant, whose childhood overlapped with the life of William Shakespeare, is our honored guest, Ralph Goldswain. Ralph Goldswain lives in London, England. He is the main content writer for NoSweatShakespeare.com, which he founded 2 decades ago and runs in partnership with his son. He also writes short stories and has published several books about the history of the Eastern Cape in South Africa. He has been a teacher but has now retired. Ralph reviews books on general topics as well as stage plays, where he specializes in performances of Shakespeare's plays. Hello, Ralph. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for having me.
William Davenant's father ran an inn, which is reasonably on the route from Stratford-upon-Avon to London and back again. When I created a map of this route, which you can download in the show notes for today's episode, it seemed very likely that Shakespeare could have often stopped at this inn on his travels to and from his home and where he worked. Ralph, was William Shakespeare good friends with the Davenant family that this would make sense?
Well, it could make sense. I think that most of the things that we know about Shakespeare are only things that we think we know about Shakespeare. Much of it is conjecture. Most of it is. But yes, there were actually 2 pubs in Corn called the Crown Tavern, both in the same street. And we don't really know which one Shakespeare stayed in. But the interesting thing is that in Shakespeare's time, there was no inn called the Crown Inn. The place that Shakespeare was supposed to have stayed was called the Salutation Tavern, and later changed its name. There's a painted room in one of them that the owners claim Shakespeare stayed in, and so they use that for tourism, but there's absolutely no evidence of that. The thing is that Shakespeare could have stayed there, and it's quite possible that he knew the Davenants. John and Jane Davenant actually were Londoners, and they lived in the theatre region, and John was a great theatre man. He absolutely loved the theatre. They lived in London at the time that Shakespeare was writing, so they could have known him at that time. But then they had 8 children, and the 8 children all died in childbirth. So they decided to leave London and they went to Oxford. They had 6 more children, of which William Davenant was one, and that's where they stayed. So there's also the story that Shakespeare was Davenant's godfather, but we don't know anything about that. At the baptism there's no record of Shakespeare having been the godfather. There is one other thing. Well, the thing is that Davenant was a great storyteller, and when he grew up, particularly when he'd had a few drinks, he used to tell wonderful stories about his childhood and knowing Shakespeare. So everyone kind of knew that William Davenant knew Shakespeare when he was a child. And one of his brothers, Robert, claimed to remember that he was bounced on Shakespeare's knee as a child when he came to stay it. So that's what we do know. But we do know that William Davenant became this very great kind of theatrical, cultural figure. And he must have got that from his father, because his father was a very, very enthusiastic theatre goer. And that is my basis for thinking that they were friends, that they met and knew each other in London.
In an article on William Davenant for No Sweat Shakespeare, Ralph writes that William Davenant frequently found himself in trouble. Ralph, will you please explain for us what kind of trouble seemed to follow Davenant through his life?
Well, it wasn't actually through his life, but it was through a great portion of his life. Although he was probably the most famous man in London in his time, particularly in the last 20 years of his life, when he was running the theatre, he was a very political animal. And he was very much on the side of royalty. And he got himself in trouble in the Civil War. When the Royalists, the first time he got in trouble was in 1641 with the first army plot. And he was tried for high treason. And he fled to France, but then he returned when the war started. And then he was involved in the siege of Gloucester in 1643, and the King Charles knighted him for that. So if we wonder how William Davenant became a knight, it was for his political activity, the siege of Gloucester. When Charles was executed in 1649, the Queen sent Davenant to Maryland as an envoy, and he didn't get very far because he was arrested in the English Channel. So that's not really very far, is it?
Not
and
far at all.
He was locked in the Tower of London for 4 years. He was actually sentenced to death. But he's interesting. Some of these things they're little human things to me, are the most interesting always. His great friend was John Milton. And the interesting thing is that John Milton was a notorious, famous Roundhead supporter, completely on the opposite side of this bitter division in the English Civil War. And yet Davenant and Milton were friends, and Milton intervened on his behalf, and so he wasn't actually executed. But that is where he wrote his so-called great poem Gondibert, when he was in the Tower. Milton said, it's not a good poem, said Milton. He said, but there are some good things in it. Actually, well, maybe in another question we'll come on to that. He was pardoned in 1654 and released from prison. After Cromwell's death in 1659, he participated in Sir George Booth's uprising in Cheshire and imprisoned again. And then he went to France after that and returned when Charles II was restored to the throne. And of course, he was very much in favour with Charles II for all of his activities in the war and before the war, and his friendship with his father and mother.
Being in trouble all the time seems to contrast starkly with his role as poet laureate during the 17th century under Charles I. Ralph, how did someone who is so often running afoul of the law become the nation's highest ranking poet?
Well, he became the poet laureate long before, 5 years before his first trouble. The interesting thing about that is that he was working in the theatre land where Shakespeare had worked, writing plays. Ben Jonson was the poet laureate, but I have to qualify that by saying that Davenant wasn't ever poet laureate, really, not in the official sense. If you were in a quiz and they asked in the quiz, who was the first poet laureate, the answer would be John Dryden. Ben Jonson was the first one, and then Davenant got it from him. By that time, Davenant had become great friends with the Queen Henrietta, and she championed him for that position. But it was just an unofficial court position. It wasn't a national paid job. John Dryden was the one who became the first poet laureate, first official poet laureate. But even then, there was fierce fighting in the court after Ben Jonson's death. But the Queen championed him, and it took 16 months before he was actually given the honorary position of poet laureate. So that was in 1638, and his first trouble was only in 1642. So it didn't conflict at all.
We know that Davenant owned several theaters and worked as a theater manager. Certainly he was a playwright, but was Davenant also an actor himself, like Shakespeare?
Well, there we come to something that gave me some trouble when I began reading up for this podcast, thinking about that. Was he an actor? No, I don't think there's any evidence that he was ever an actor or that he ever acted at all. He was very much a theatre man, but I cannot find any place that he could have acted in. Just to give you a brief summary of his history and how he came to be the great theatre man that he was, he went to grammar school of All Saints at Oxford, and then he went to Lincoln College, Oxford, where he matriculated, but he didn't actually take a degree. His father got him a job with the eccentric Duchess of Richmond. She died quite soon after, and then he moved on. The job that he had was as a page. And then he moved on to be the page of the great statesman and poet and playwright, Fulk Grenville. And there again, he didn't stay there long either, because Grenville was murdered in 1628. And so Davenant found himself without a job. So he went back to live with his father, and he was kicking his heels. One thing we have to understand about Davenant, that he was a man of the most enormous energy of any person I've ever read about. He had the most enormous energy. And all the time, through all the troubles that he had later in the wars and all that, he kept on writing plays. He never stopped. He didn't act at all. As I say, he had his two jobs as a page in these two households. And then he went to live with his father, and he decided to write a play because his father was very much a keen theatre man. So he wrote this play called Elberwein. It's not a very good play. I have to tell you that nobody ever puts on any of Davenant's plays anymore. But he wrote scores of plays in his life. But he wrote this play, the Elberwein, and put it on in Oxford. And the people loved it. They loved it, even though it wasn't much of a play. So he thought, okay, well, I can write a play. So then he sat down and he took up his quill and he began writing plays. And he wrote The Cruel Brother and The Just Italian and several others. And then he began to be known as a playwright. So then he went to London and he started working as a playwright in London. And at that time, the great architect, Inigo Jones, was very much in favor with the court. And Inigo Jones was putting on all kinds of activities, entertainment activities in the court, pageants and masks and all that. And he had the great man of his time, Ben Jonson, as his librettist. And Ben Jonson was doing all the poetic, the words for these various pageants. The Queen loved them, and she acted in them herself. And of course, she was frowned on by the Puritans and all that, but she loved these pageants. Inigo Jones and Ben Jonson had a falling out. And Inigo Jones looked around for somebody to write the words for his pageants. And Davenant popped up, of course. Davenant always seems to pop up in the right place. And then Davenant became a favorite of the royal couple, of the king and queen.
Wow. That's impressive.
And that's how he became poet laureate as well. So he began to work and he became a courtier. And that's, of course, later on, during the time that you weren't allowed to put plays on. What he did was he was very cunning. He opened a theatre in Drury Lane. And what he did was the law said you weren't allowed to put on plays. So he looked at the law very carefully, and it didn't say anything about operas. So he put on operas. He actually wrote operas and put them on to get around the law.
Wow.
So that is what he did, but not acting. So I've gone right off the point of
but
your
such
question.
Fun stuff. I mean, I didn't know that he was so shrewd to get, because I knew that there was this time when plays were not allowed. And I was thinking that at some point over his life, Davenant actually held one of the only patents for performing public anything, but I didn't know it was operas.
Yeah, no, he wasn't allowed. The law said you couldn't put on plays. So it wasn't plays, but they were plays with music.
So he found a workaround. That was smart.
That was very smart, yeah, but he never gave up. And also, Davenant was a man who always was able to charm everyone. He must have been a fantastically likable man because everybody loved him.
It sounds like he really must have been. Now, you alluded to this earlier. William Davenant would have just been 10 years old when William Shakespeare died. Is there any evidence to suggest Davenant would have attended the funeral or any subsequent publications or primary documents that might suggest Davenant was personally impacted by the passing of Shakespeare? I know that when Davenant was about 12, he wrote a poem dedicated to Shakespeare called In Remembrance of Master Shakespeare. And I know you mentioned his brother Robert would talk about being bounced on Shakespeare's knee. Was there actually a connection to Shakespeare for Davenant's childhood? Did he know him in a personal way during his life?
All we have is what I've already told you about the possibility, and also Davenant talking about it in his adulthood when he, with his friends and reminiscing about it. But it wouldn't have been possible. Nobody went to Shakespeare's funeral. Shakespeare died and he was buried 2 days later. I mean, these days, if somebody dies, and we often go to funerals, and we can get on an aeroplane and travel right across the world for a funeral, some of us, today. But in Shakespeare's time, no, everything was very much more local than things are today. And Shakespeare wasn't famous in Stratford, actually. He was he was actually the most famous playwright in London, and he was lauded by everyone. And, but he was known in Stratford as a respectable, well-off citizen, the son of a man who had been the mayor of Stratford. And that was it. And it was only his wife and his family and a couple of neighbours that went to the funeral. In any case, the news of Shakespeare's death wouldn't have reached Oxford until long after Shakespeare was buried. So there's no chance that Davenant would have gone to his funeral. When he was 12, he wrote this poem. And I mean, if I were to read you a stanza from this poem, just shows that Davenant wasn't much of a poet, although he was poet laureate and he produced books of poetry. He wasn't, he lived in a time of poets like Milton and John Donne and Ben Jonson, poets like that, and Davenant, you will never find a Davenant poem in any anthology at all because he wasn't much of a poet, and you won't find his plays staged at all, but he was a great trier, and he was. It's almost like if you in 200 years' time, will we ever have heard of Barbara Cartland, or J.K. Rowling, or someone like that? No, but we may have heard of some other writers that live in the same time as those writers. But here, his poem that he wrote at 12 was very precocious. It was a poem that kind of suggested that nature was weeping for Shakespeare. And this was, of course, much later than Shakespeare's death. Each tree whose thick and spreading growth hath made rather a night beneath the boughs than shade, unwilling now to grow, looks like the plume a captive wears, whose riffled falls are steeped with tears, which from his last rage flow. Nothing there to grab you, is there? Anyway, so but the latter part of your question is about the impact that Shakespeare had. Davenant was a great theatre man, and he recognized Shakespeare as his spiritual father, if you like, and his mentor. And he was a great Shakespeare devotee all of his life. What he did was he was a collector of Shakespeare memorabilia. And this is where it becomes interesting for me, these other little things. He collected all kinds of things from Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare had a portrait painted by his friend John Taylor. Let me just go back for a moment on this question of what did Shakespeare look like? Because there's all this thing, what did Shakespeare actually look like? We have it's like Jesus. We say, what did Jesus look like? And we see these pictures of this ginger-haired guy with a ginger beard and that. And we say, that's... And so Shakespeare has a kind of form that we say, that looks like Shakespeare. And of course, there are all these drawings on websites and things. But there is one painting, the Chandos painting, which was painted by his friend John Taylor in his middle years. So Shakespeare's middle years were like late 30s. And John Taylor must have known what Shakespeare looked like, or he wouldn't have been able to paint a portrait. And I think that it may be that Davenant did actually see Shakespeare when he was a child and knew what he looked like. Anyway, the first owner of the Chandos portrait was William Davenant. We know that. And also, something else that's interesting is that, in the Duke's Theatre, all those years the Duke's Theatre was in Lincoln Inn Fields. It was pulled down and renovated and so on. In the 19th century, when they were doing some renovating in the building, they found a bust of Shakespeare behind one of the walls. That is known as the Davenant bust. So I'm not sure exactly where it is. I've tried to find out where it is, but I couldn't. But there are pictures of it on the internet, and again, they look like the Chandos portrait. So, and the other thing finally about this is that whatever happened, whatever Davenant did in the theatre, he always honored Shakespeare. He put on Shakespeare's plays. He even adapted them. He turned them into musicals. He did worked with Shakespeare's plays a hell of a lot. So, and when he was given the charter to run the King's company, the King gave him the exclusive rights to produce Shakespeare plays. 10 of Shakespeare's most popular plays he had exclusive rights to. So that's all through his life. He did honor Shakespeare. And so
one of the most persistent suggestions among scholars and historians alike about Davenant that I want to ask you about, mostly to set us straight about this, because I think it's a myth that people argue over, but it's the idea that Davenant may have been more than just Shakespeare's godson, but also his illegitimate biological son. Where does this claim come from, Ralph? And can you explain whether or not there's any evidence to this suggestion?
I think it comes from Davenant himself. I think one of the things, as I said to you before, that he was a most likable fella. Everybody loved Davenant. And I think that one of the things they liked about him was that he had a great sense of humor, and he was a great storyteller. Well, he would have been writing all these plays, I suppose, So he was a great storyteller. And there was a writer in the 17th century called John Aubrey. He was the 17th century man about town equivalent of the gossip columnist that you find today. I don't know if you still get them because I don't read those journals, but you find the gossip, about the gossip stories about movie stars and all that.
Yeah.
And who they're dating and all that. He was that kind of writer. And he wrote about every famous person you can think of. He interviewed a lot of people. And the story goes that the poet Samuel Butler was a great friend of Davenant. Davenant had lots of friends, lots of friends. Samuel Butler was one of his friends, and he told John Aubrey that when Davenant had something, quite a lot to drink, he used to laugh that Shakespeare was having it off with his mother, and he was therefore Shakespeare's illegitimate child. And he also said at the same time that, that he was his spiritual child anyway, whether he was or not Shakespeare's illegitimate child. But apparently Jane Davenant, William's mother, was a very beautiful woman. But when you think about it, there she was, being the wife, helping her husband run this inn, this tavern. She had 6 children growing up there in Oxford in the tavern. She was pregnant most of the time. She was raising these 6 children. And any mother would know that it would be a very difficult thing for her to be running off with a guest and having an affair every time he came to town. So I don't think there's anything.
Not much substance there, no.
There's not much substance, no. But then, of course, we don't know because we weren't there.
Now, this was an interesting observation that I made and I wanted to ask you about just out of curiosity. In the portrait of William Davenant that I was able to find, his nose seems to be disfigured. Ralph, was Davenant's face maligned after some injury, or was he born that way, or is this just a bad portrait?
Well, in 1630, he unfortunately got himself into a situation where he contracted syphilis. Eventually, his nose fell off. And he had plastic surgery done on his nose, believe it or not, because there was just a hole in his face where his nose should be. So he got hold of this Thomas Cademan, this doctor who was treating him for syphilis. And I think he was very lucky to survive to be 62 years old, because Schubert, for example, died at the age of 30 from the lead that was given to him as treatment for syphilis. But anyway, Davenant survived to be 62, and he spent all that time, even though he was a most popular man, he spent all that time with no nose. There was a hole where his nose was. Now, he had the plastic surgery done, and that wasn't a great success. When he had that portrait done, the painter was doing the best he could to try and create a nose. You'll see in that portrait a tiny little nose, but what it was just a stub. And there was this Italian surgeon, Gaspare Tagliacozzi, who did plastic surgery. And what he did was he explained how he did it. He would cut a nose shape in the patient's arm. He would then take the skin around the cut and then put it on here on the face so that it would grow into the skin of the cheeks. And then the patient would have to walk around for a few months with his arms strapped to his nose until it took. And when it took, then down came the arm, and then the doctor would then shape that flap of skin into a nose. So that was the plastic surgery.
Oh, that sounds horrendous.
It is horrific, and yeah.
So that's why the portrait looks a little funny. The portraitist must have done a good job, because it didn't look to me, I didn't think at first that his nose was actually missing. That's incredible. That says a lot about, I think it almost is an understatement to say he was extremely charming for him to have been so impressively popular with something that would have made people sort of afraid of him, I think, to physically look at him. So,
well, yes, he was. But the thing is about Davenant too is that apart from all these things, so many friends, eating and drinking with them, and very much a favorite of the Queen and the King. He was a man of enormous self-confidence. He didn't care that he didn't have a nose. He just,
yeah. And why? He had so much to.
He was so secure and confident, and he was so talented and intelligent. Anyway, this nose thing, the arm up there like that he had to walk around with, strapped to his face. This lady Hester Pulter, one of the few 17th century female poets, wrote a little piece about this to Sir William Davenant upon the unspeakable loss of the most conspicuous and chief ornament of his frontispiece. In pity, trust me, I think no man but would his leg or arm expose to cut you out another nose.
Wow.
So that was William Davenant. Not a very, even if without the nose, if you forgot about the nose and you look at a picture of him, he wasn't a good-looking man. He looked somehow strange, I think, But there we go. He didn't care about that at all.
Now, you said he lived to be 64, and that's a longer, obviously, than Shakespeare lived, who only lived 52 years. Yeah. What did William Davenant die of eventually, and where is he buried?
Well, William Davenant, he died of syphilis eventually. It caught up with him, and that was what he died of. Well, we can't be absolutely 100% sure. I mean, we don't know what killed Beethoven, for example, even, because you never know. But the story goes that it was the syphilis that killed him. He is buried actually in Poets' Corner. And the interesting thing, another little interesting snippet here, is that there was a rival that he had who was a Roundhead. And that, let me just see if I can find his name. I can't even remember his name. He was almost an unknown person. But this Roundhead rival of his was buried in Poets' Corner. And what they did was, the royalists who loved Davenant, they dug a grave up in Poets' Corner, and they took the body out and took it somewhere else, this other poet that had been buried by the Cromwell people in Poets' Corner. And they put Davenant in the grave, very close to Ben Jonson. And the interesting thing to me is that Ben Jonson has an inscription on his tomb which says, "O rare Ben Jonson." And on Davenant's tomb, guess what? It's just a little stone piece. "O rare William Davenant." "Oh, rare Sir William Davenant." So it's like a copy of the Jonson tomb. But I don't know whether it was somebody's sense of humor or whether it was a genuine tribute to him that he was compared with Ben Jonson, who was, of course, by the time that Davenant died, Ben Jonson was regarded as greater than Shakespeare, I think. I mean, because he kind of stayed the course, he lived to much longer. But there is a statue of Shakespeare, a life-size statue of Shakespeare, right next to Davenant's grave in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey.
Oh, that's nice. I didn't know that. How sweet. That's the next best thing, since Shakespeare didn't want to be put in Poets' Corner, to have the statue there, I guess.
That's right.
I know, Ralph, that we would love to learn more about William Davenant. What are some of your favorite books and resources that you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, I think that there's a very interesting one with lots of these stories by a writer called Simon Andrew Stirlings, published 2016, so it's quite new, by the History Press, called Shakespeare's Bastard. Shakespeare's Bastard, by Simon Andrew Stirlings, which is full of interesting information about. Also, I think that a must-read. Remember I told you about John Aubrey, who was the gossip columnist at the time. He wrote his book about all the people that he wrote about. It's called Brief Lives, very famous. Brief Lives by John Aubrey, edited by Andrew Clark, 1898. And then The Lives of the Poets Laureate by Wiltshire, Stanton Austen, and John Ralph, 1853. That's a very interesting book if you want to know about. That puts William Davenant in context with the other poet laureates.
Those are great resources. Thank you so much. We will link to these resources as well as No Sweat Shakespeare, where you can read Ralph's work on William Davenant, in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure that you check there for all of these resources. Ralph, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I assume that I'm on this desert island for many years. And the Bible and complete Shakespeare is going to keep me occupied all that time. But for something else, if I want, again, like with the Shakespeare, a complete range of human emotions and behavior, and if I want to have a good laugh, and something that if I'm there longer than I should be, then I can read again. I think it would have to be the complete works of Charles Dickens.
Oh, that's an excellent choice for sure. I think actually you're the first person to make that selection for their desert island choice there. And I agree with you that you'd be well set up on your desert island for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, the thing is, as you can see, I'm an old man, and although writers never retire, and I don't think I ever will retire, I could regard myself in semi-retirement. You have a website and you know that it's a voracious monster, that you have to keep feeding it. And if you don't, it becomes irrelevant on the internet. So to keep your one site relevant, I keep on working on the No Sweat Shakespeare. What we do is my son looks to see what people are searching for, and he sends me an email with a list of things, and then I write them and we put them up, and then Google enjoys that and sends them up to the top. So
that's a brilliant setup.
But also what I am doing now, and I'm having trouble with that because it's so difficult, is trying to start a new website doing great novels. So, great novels. I just finished
Dickens?
Like Dickens. Oh, yes. I've just finished doing The Great Gatsby, and because I'm loving it, because I'm rereading all these novels and then thinking about them and then writing about them. So I'm in my element, except that if you're doing it for a website and you want to get the thing going, you have to work faster than I'm working, because it's taken us 20 years to get the Shakespeare to what it is now. And I don't think I've got 20 years to get on and do novels in that way.
We'll be more hopeful than that. When you get it up and running, please make sure you send it to us, because I know we would love to keep up with you and the work that you're doing. I so appreciate your time today, and Ralph, for being here and talking with us about William Davenant. He's so fascinating, and I've enjoyed exploring his life with you today. Thank you so much. To find out more about William Davenant, including a free download of the hand-illustrated pub map showing the possible pubs along the route between Stratford-upon-Avon and London that Shakespeare could have made his way to on his way to and from London and home, as well as to find more information on Ralph and No Sweat Shakespeare, including links to the resources recommended in today's episode, be sure to visit the fully packed, full of history show notes at castycash.com/episode 138. That's all the good stuff at castycash.com/EP138. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview, as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else, right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.